there is a kind of silence that does not arrive suddenly. It builds, it stretches, it answers questions by refusing to respond. In the weeks before anyone knew something was wrong, that silence had already settled into the Watts household. It did not announce itself. It did not disrupt routines. It simply replaced something that used to be there: connection, presence, weight. And no one noticed at first. Not because they were careless, but because silence, when it wears the shape of normal life, is easy to misread. This story does not begin with violence. It begins with what was missing: a pause where response should have been, a stillness where emotion once lived, a man who learned how to disappear while standing in plain sight. Welcome to this channel. Here we don't chase shock, we examine patterns, we sit with discomfort, and we try carefully, reluctantly, to understand what evidence reveals when words fail. If you value that kind of storytelling, take a moment to subscribe and stay with us. These stories demand patience and attention. 7 years after the crime, the confession still feels incomplete. Not because details are unknown, but because meaning is. Chris Watts spoke, but what he never said matters just as much. Before the disappearance, there was an image, carefully assembled, maintained daily. Photos of smiling children, a tidy home, birthday parties, videos filled with forced cheer and domestic rituals, a family that looked from the outside like proof that effort guarantees happiness. Shannon Watts believed in visibility. She documented her life not to deceive, but to anchor it, to convince herself that momentum could overcome instability, that love, if shown often enough, could hold everything together. She worked, she organized, she planned. She reached outward. Chris did not. He stood beside her in those videos, quiet, compliant, seemingly supportive. He rarely interrupted, rarely contradicted, rarely asserted. To many he looked calm, dependable, easygoing. But calm is not the same as present, and compliance is not the same as care. Financial records later showed pressure mounting beneath the surface, debt that grew quietly, obligations that stacked without resolution, stress that had nowhere to go because Chris Watts had no language for conflict. Avoidance became his primary skill. When tension appeared, he withdrew. When expectations increased, he narrowed inward. When choices demanded confrontation, he chose silence. Shannon noticed the change before anyone else did. Of course she did. She lived inside it. Messages became shorter. Responses came later. Physical closeness faded without explanation. There were no arguments that matched the distance, no explosions, no visible breakdowns. Just absence. She asked questions, she tried to reconnect, she adjusted her tone, she searched for reassurance. Chris offered none. This imbalance, one partner reaching, the other receding, created a quiet instability, not dramatic enough to alarm outsiders, not clear enough to name, but devastating in its accumulation. Psychologically, withdrawal is not neutral. It is an action, a decision to disengage rather than confront, and over time, disengagement reshapes reality. Chris Watts did not express resentment. He absorbed it. He did not articulate dissatisfaction. He internalized it. And somewhere in that internal space, a second life began to form, not physically at first, but emotionally. Fantasy does not announce itself either. It slips in gently. It offers relief without responsibility. An imagined future without debt, without conflict, without children to disappoint, without a wife whose expectations mirrored the life he no longer wanted to inhabit. When the affair began, it did not look like rebellion. It looked like escape. In that alternate emotional world, Chris was not a husband failing to meet obligations. He was uncomplicated, desired, unburdened. There were no overdue bills there. No family routines. No history. Fantasy reduced his life to the present moment, and the present moment felt lighter. But fantasy is not just distraction. It is rehearsal. As his emotional investment shifted, his physical presence receded further. Missed calls, avoided eye contact, mechanical interactions with his children. Caregivers noticed small changes, less affection, less engagement, a father who went through motions but no longer lingered. These are not dramatic warning signs, they are subtle, easy to rationalize: fatigue, stress, work. But in hindsight they align. Psychological deterioration rarely looks like collapse. It looks like narrowing. Chris Watts' world grew smaller as his inner life detached from reality. The responsibilities remained, but emotionally he was already gone. Law enforcement would later describe his demeanor as calm, cooperative, almost passive. That calm existed long before the investigation. When Shannon and the children were reported missing, the silence that had lived privately became public. And suddenly, absence demanded explanation. Chris stood on camera. His words were measured, his face composed. He appealed for their return without urgency, without visible panic. What he said mattered less than how he said it. Language analysts would later note inconsistencies, not lies shouted loudly but truths avoided quietly, passive constructions, vague timelines, emotional flatness. This was not chaos. This was control. As investigators retraced steps, patterns emerged: GPS data, phone records, deviations from routine. Each fact stripped away another layer of the image. When confronted, Chris did not explode. He collapsed inward. His confession came not as release, but as negotiation: partial truths, shifting responsibility, fragmented explanations that minimized intent. Confession in this case was not transparency. It was containment. Experts would later emphasize that this was not a crime of passion. It was not impulsive. It was decided. The absence of rage is not evidence of innocence. Sometimes it is evidence of resolve. In court, the facts were presented plainly. No spectacle, no theatrical defense. The crime was described as methodical, planned, executed with chilling calm. And still questions lingered. Not about what happened, but why silence was chosen over confrontation, why escape required erasure. Because entitlement does not always look aggressive. Sometimes it looks like avoidance. Chris Watts did not believe he could leave. He believed he deserved a life without consequence. And when reality contradicted that belief, he chose control over accountability. 7 years later, the legacy of this case is not the confession. It is the warning embedded in ordinary behavior. That withdrawal can be deadly. That fantasy, when untreated, can override empathy. That silence, when prolonged, can become permission. Shannon Watts is remembered not for perfection but for effort, for reaching outward, for believing connection could still be restored. The children are remembered in routines, in bedtime rituals, in small, ordinary moments that should have continued. If this story unsettles you, it should, not because it is rare, but because it is quiet. If you believe these stories matter, engage with this channel. Share your reflections. Ask the hard questions. Awareness begins with attention, and remembrance begins with refusing to look away. Because some crimes are not explosions. They are exits. And they begin long before anyone notices the door closing. The investigation did not move quickly because it needed to. It moved carefully because it had to. There was no shattered glass. No frantic 911 call filled with panic. No signs of a struggle loud enough to announce violence. Instead, there was order. Investigators noted how clean the house appeared, how nothing seemed disturbed, how the absence itself felt curated, as if whatever had happened was meant to leave no emotional residue behind. This kind of order is not accidental. It reflects a mindset focused on containment. Chris Watts answered questions with a politeness that bordered on detachment. He cooperated. He complied. He did not resist, but cooperation is not the same as truth. When asked to recount timelines, he spoke in approximations. When pressed on emotional moments, he deflected toward logistics. His language remained passive, as if events had unfolded around him rather than through him. This linguistic distance matters. People who experience trauma often struggle to speak because memory overwhelms them. People who commit calculated acts often struggle to speak because language threatens control. As interviews continued, the contrast sharpened. Shannon's communications, texts, voice messages, notes were saturated with effort. She reached outward even when the responses thinned. She expressed fear, confusion, hope, and resolve, often in the same breath. She was trying to stabilize something she could feel slipping, but could not name. That is the quiet cruelty of emotional withdrawal. It denies the other person clarity. It turns relationship into guesswork. Chris Watts never told Shannon he was done. He never articulated finality. He let ambiguity do the work for him. Ambiguity preserves comfort for the person creating it. Psychologists later described his behavior as consistent with extreme emotional avoidance paired with entitlement. Not entitlement expressed through dominance, but entitlement expressed through erasure. If conflict could not be resolved, it could be removed. If responsibility could not be managed, it could be eliminated. This is not impulsivity. It is reasoning stripped of empathy. As forensic evidence accumulated, the fantasy world Chris had constructed began to collapse under its own contradictions. Timelines no longer aligned. Digital records contradicted spoken accounts. Small lies multiplied to protect larger ones. Control requires consistency, and consistency is fragile. When the full confession finally emerged, it did not arrive as a cathartic release. It came fragmented, revised, adjusted. Each version attempted to reposition responsibility, first subtly, then more explicitly. Confession in this context was not remorse. It was adaptation. Experts noted that even in admission, Chris Watts remained emotionally contained. He spoke of events without language that acknowledged the humanity of those he had taken from the world. There were facts, but there was no relational understanding. In court, the proceedings were brief, the evidence overwhelming, the plea decisive. There would be no drawn-out trial, no competing narratives. And yet, the absence of spectacle did not bring peace. Because this case was never about proving guilt. It was about confronting motive. The prosecution emphasized clarity over drama. This was not an accident. This was not a momentary lapse. This was a sequence of decisions made in service of a desired outcome. The outcome was freedom, defined narrowly, selfishly, and without regard for cost. Freedom from debt. Freedom from expectation. Freedom from emotional labor. The court made clear, explanation does not equal justification. Understanding behavior does not absolve responsibility. Chris Watts was sentenced not just for what he did, but for what he chose not to do. He chose not to speak, not to leave, not to face consequences honestly. He chose silence until silence became irreversible. 7 years later, the case still circulates, not because of unanswered questions, but because of uncomfortable answers. This was not a monster hiding in shadows. This was a man embedded in routine. He worked, he smiled, he followed instructions, he avoided conflict so successfully that no one realized avoidance had become his identity. That is what makes this story linger. because it suggests that danger does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives through disengagement so gradual it feels like normal aging of a relationship. The legacy of Shannon Watts is not found in curated images. It is found in persistence, in attempts to communicate, in belief that effort mattered. She was not naive. She was hopeful. And hope in the face of withdrawal can become a liability, not because it is wrong, but because it is exploited. The children are remembered not through tragedy, but through absence, through the routines that stopped, the voices that no longer filled rooms, the future that collapsed quietly. In remembering them, it is important to resist reducing their lives to symbols. They were not lessons, they were people. And the lesson, if there is one, belongs to the living. Silence is not neutral. Withdrawal is not harmless. Fantasy, when it replaces accountability, becomes permission. This case forces us to reconsider how we define warning signs, not just anger or violence, but emotional disappearance. If someone stops engaging, stops responding, stops participating in shared reality, that absence deserves attention. Because avoidance is not passive. It is directional. As you reflect on this story, consider what it asks of us, not as spectators, but as participants in relationships, communities, and systems that often reward compliance over honesty. If this documentary made you uncomfortable, engage with that discomfort. Share your thoughts in the comments, not speculation, but reflection. What patterns stood out to you? What silences felt loudest? If you believe stories like this should be told with restraint and respect, support the channel. Subscribe. Return. These narratives demand time and intention. And finally, remember the names that matter. Not for how they were lost, but for how they lived. Because the most devastating crimes are not always loud. They are quiet decisions made repeatedly. They are exits disguised as endurance. And they remind us that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is stop speaking altogether.